Welcome, everybody. My name is Tariq Masood. I am a professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the faculty director of its Middle East initiative. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar, which is the second seminar of the fall semester for the Middle East initiative. And we are really thrilled to be joined today by Professor Thomas Hegghammer. Before I recite Professor Hegghammer's official bio, I should say that he is one of the most gifted scholars of jihadism, of political Islam, and indeed of the Middle East writing today. He is a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Defence Establishment in Oslo, and he's actually joining us from Oslo. He studied at Oxford and Sciences Po in Paris. He's held fellowships at a number of prestigious universities, including this one, which is where I met him. He was also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and he's published very widely. First of all, he's the author of two incredible books. The first is called Jihad in Saudi Arabia. The second is his new book, which I hope you can see, The Caravan, Abdullah Azzam and the Rise of Global Jihad, which is just an extraordinary work of scholarship. He's also the editor of Jihadi Culture. This is somebody who really knows political Islam and its violent manifestations in particular. He's also published in every academic journal that one would want to publish in, including the American Political Science Review. He is just an extraordinary scholar who's had immense influence, testifying before the US Congress, the British Parliament. His op-eds have appeared everywhere. And today is the culmination of his career because he gets to speak in our seminar. No, actually, it's the culmination of our seminar. So I want to just, Professor Hegghammer will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes on the theme of can jihadism be predicted? And then he and I will engage in a little bit of back and forth, and then we will open up to the audience for your questions. And you can direct those questions to Professor Hegghammer directly by just raising your hand in the Zoom function, or you can send your question to me in the chat and I will ask it on your behalf. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Hegghammer. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tariq, for that very generous introduction. I guess it can only go downhill from here. But I am thrilled to be here and I really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. And my only regret is that we couldn't meet in person. It's little I would have liked more than to be in Cambridge and meet you all. I see several friends and distinguished colleagues in the audience here. So I chose the topic for a couple of reasons. One is that recently things took an unexpected turn in Afghanistan, and we're seeing another wave of speculation and chatter on Twitter and in the media about what's coming next. Will Al-Qaeda rebounds? Will militants elsewhere be invigorated by the Taliban's success, etc.? So kind of a large part of at least the sort of the kind of the politically interested are sort of in speculation mode. So I think it's of a certain public interest to know whether there's any point really at these sort of prediction exercises, or what we, or if we are to engage in them, what we should think about. The other motivation is kind of a more general frustration of having put so much time into studying this thing and still understanding so little of it. Basically, I've been just so frustrated over my own inability to see things coming. And it goes back to the very beginning. I began working on militant Islamism in the summer of 2001. I got a summer internship here at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment. Brynjar Lia, who some of you may know, had brought me on to work on what was then known as the Bin Laden network. So I spent the summer of 2001 looking into this, and at the same time making plans for later that autumn of doing something else, because I was looking at this and thinking, oh, these are just some widows up in the mountains in Afghanistan. Nothing's going to come of this. I have better find myself something more kind of relevant to work on. In fact, my plan was to go to Cairo that autumn and sort of get an internship in a newspaper or something. But so I was dead wrong there, and have been wrong multiple occasions afterwards. I, for example, the invasion of Iraq, I think I'm on the record as saying it will produce new groups, anti-Western ones, but I didn't quite foresee the scale of it. I was wrong again I think around 2010. Facebook was becoming a big thing, and I said, no, jihadis are never going to get on Facebook because they're going to be so much more easily tracked there by authorities. And for the next 4 years, jihadis were exploiting Facebook and Twitter and these mainstream platforms on a large scale. I, like many others, didn't predict the Arab Spring, the carnage in Syria, and the enormous rise in activity from transnational jihadi groups, famously represented by Islamic State. I didn't see that coming. And I was wrong again a bit later, when I panicked for a bit in Europe when activity levels got really high, and I wrote a piece in 2016, I think it was, suggesting, this can go badly. But then it turned out that the phenomenon kind of quite down, and wrong again. So it could very well be that it's just me who's cognitively challenged. But I have a sense that I'm not the only one who's sort of can't quite get to grips with this thing. And we have obviously 9/11. Very few people kind of saw that coming and saw the kind of the era changing consequences it would have. And nor did I don't think many people saw the rise of Islamic State and the foreign fighter phenomenon and everything else in the 2010s either. I'll come back to that, and about how all the optimism around 2011, when we killed bin Laden and democracy seemed to be flourishing and so on, and how that was completely wrong as well. So so hopefully it's not only me, and so it might be useful to reflect together here on this. And so this is not a kind of a traditional paper presentation, although I do plan to write something on this and to collect some data on paper on sort of predictions in the literature. I actually had hoped to do this for this talk, but it's just not ready yet, because it turned out to be much more difficult than I thought. Just identifying predictions in the literature is quite complicated. So, but for now, for today, I guess this will be more of a sort of an essay in presentation form, and I'm really interested in your feedback and discussions afterwards. So the short answer to my question is no. And so this could be a very short talk, but I guess, I presume it'd be useful for you to hear why I say no. And I'll elaborate over this in kind of 4 parts. First, about whether we should be engaged in this exercise at all. Secondly, the history of prediction in this domain. What does it look like? Third, and mainly, why we tend to get things wrong. What do I think we have learned about why we were wrong? And fourth, what despite all my failures, what are my thoughts on the way ahead? I guess my main argument is that we do a bit too much prediction in the kind of wider field of sort of jihadism studies and analysis, but there is a place for it if it's done well, and I think it can help us improve our understanding of the phenomenon. So first of all, should we even be asking this question? Is this should we as academics, social scientists, be in the business of predicting or forecasting? Because in practice, much of what we're dealing with is sort of forecasting. Shouldn't this be the domain of kind of policymakers, intelligence services, etc.? I have a whole lot of sympathy for that view. I have many frustrations about the wider world of kind of terrorism analysis and so on, and I think there's too much predicting and speculation, and there's way too little accountability of people being kind of forced to look back at their predictions, or often doomsday predictions of the past, and explain them. But still, I think there are some good reasons why some prediction exercise might be called for. One is that people do this for all kinds of topics, and so it's not a peculiarity of jihadism studies or terrorism studies. And people do it. We do it for all kinds of political phenomena, if not explicitly in articles titled "The Future of This and That and the Other," then at the tail end of articles or in Q&A sessions of talks, etc. People are often, asked and invited to and indulge in thoughts about the future of whatever phenomenon they're studying. And if we limit it to sort of the wider kind of extremism field, it's certainly not only the jihadism scholars who do this. It's also done in the study of the far right. Just for take a recent US example, many of you will remember that in this winter, before and after the 6th of January incident, there was quite a bit of commentary and predictions about a coming wave of far right violence, which at least we're in September now, and it hasn't really materialized, at least on a scale I think that some of the early predictions suggested. So this is this is not peculiar to this particular field, although I do think jihadism people do it probably a bit more. The other thing is that demand for this type of assessment is generally very high, and it's so high that people making important decisions are going to make predictions anyway, and a case can be made that if we as academics completely skirt the issue of projection or prediction, important decisions are going to be made on based on lower quality, even lower quality analyses, and there's also the reality that the people who kind of whose job it is to to forecast and to write predictions in say intelligence services or in government for planning, they look to academics for clues about what we think about the future anyway. They look for it in the introductions and the conclusions of our writings, and they, whenever they find some hint that can be kind of extrapolated into some prediction, they latch onto it and they use it as ammunition for their views. So to think that it is even possible to isolate our academic endeavors, completely from the realm of prediction, I think is naive and an illusion. And I think it's better to have a kind of an clear and open sort of acknowledgement of this and recognition of this than to pretend it doesn't exist. But of course, there are some huge ethical concerns here, because do you think that academic claims carry weight? And there is there's certainly the risk that if you engage in guesswork, or speculation or bad prediction, and it's cloaked as science, then you can cause harm. Your statements can be used to inform decisions with very grave consequences, especially in this domain. You can get people killed. You can get a lot of people killed. Or it can lead to extreme, waste, expenditure, over expenditure of certain things. So, we may not be able to avoid it, but we should certainly be do it with responsibly. The third, and I guess perhaps more relevant for this context, is that I think it can be scientifically useful, and this is probably why there are very serious social scientists who engage in it. And so I mean, one of the perhaps leading scholars on this is, and recently joined the Kennedy School, I believe, J. Alfelder. And there are people who try to predict major political developments like coups and revolutions and things like that, and do it very systematically, as a way of, as another kind of as an epistemological approach, as a way to sort of test models, and it has the advantage of making hindsight impossible. So there is I think some value here in sort of in that it can force us to make our underlying sort of assumptions and models more clearer. The third point is that, fourth point is that I think the history of prediction is interesting in its own right. It's inherently interesting for what it, as kind of as insight into history, because as many will know, and people who study science fiction, for example, have long pointed out that science fiction is more, above everything else, it's a window into the present. It's a window into how people view the world around them at the point in time when the kind of the future vision was sort of recorded. And so studying the history of prediction in this and other fields, I think, is interesting, as it tells us something about how people viewed the world at that time, and can perhaps generate some thoughts and insights on why that was the case, why it changed, etc. So which brings us to the history of jihadism prediction. What does it look like? And the first thing I can say is that I'm going to be painting with a broad brush, because it's probably impossible to compile the universe of predictions about jihadism, because it's made in a wide variety of contexts, not just in academic articles and books, but also in sort of papers and talks and interviews with media, etc. And so I'm going to have to sort of simplify and sort of characterize collective opinion in ways that perhaps is sometimes somewhat unjust, and I hope you correct me afterwards, if I'm completely wrong on some of this. But broadly speaking, I think we can say that first of all, that there's a big divide at 9/11 that really, and this has to do with the history of the word itself, jihadism. That it's a relatively new word and was very rarely used prior to 9/11. So you don't really have, at least not explicit, I think it's not explicit academic prediction attempts for militant Islamism. You have it obliquely in some early kind of works on militancy in particular countries like Egypt or Algeria and so on. But no, as far as I know, no kind of sort of general attempts. What you have instead in the pre-9/11 era are a number of works and books, in particular, about kind of Islamism writ large, political Islam more broadly. Some of them, by very prominent academics like Gilles Kepel, Olivier Roy, and many others, where there's an element of, but they say things about the militants, but they're usually broader reflections on kind of Islamism and its state and future. So, but the 9/11 changes everything, and this is when what's somewhat appropriately has been called the terrorism industry really flourishes, and you get a lot of writings in various forms about jihadism, Al Qaeda, where's Al Qaeda going, all this sort of thing, and even if you just keep it to academic articles, there are tens of academic articles with containing terms like future, jihadism or Al Qaeda or ISIS and so on. So a genre of prediction emerges. Also, in content and tone, there is a big shift at 9/11 in the sense that I think we can say that prior to 9/11 there was underestimation and a sense that, at least perhaps in retrospect, a lack of appreciation for how long-lasting this phenomenon might be. After 9/11, you get the opposite. You get almost relentless overestimation and a seemingly endless amount of writing about sort of the rising threat of this, rising threat from that. The general tone is sort of one of kind of predicting increase and sort of increased severity. Although we may have to distinguish here between two sort of types, two discourses, or two sort of communities. There's one sort of community, if we might call it that, or sort of a set of commentators who will almost always say that the threat is rising, and so in some sense, there's no variation there. But if you look at the people who say things or write things about militant Islamism in the 2000s to 2010s, where there is some variation, there are some patterns that emerge, I think, and they're not that far from the kind of the assessment mistakes that I made myself, that I mentioned earlier. Especially a kind of an underestimation of the scale of the Iraq, kind of the effect that the Iraq invasion would have. I think everyone agreed that it would have a negative effect in this domain, but perhaps not quite as much. I mean, David Patel might correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think basically things turned out worse than many suspected. Later, there was, as I mentioned, a sense of optimism at the turn of the decade, so around 2010, with a they sent, and a certainly justified sense, somewhat based on the activity levels in the region and in the West, that basically transnational jihadi groups were losing steam, and that when you got to 2011, and you got the Arab Spring and the assassination of Osama bin Laden, that we were perhaps turning a corner. Here again, I'm simplifying, and I'm sure there are people who will say in retrospect that they were a lot less optimistic than I was suggesting. But I think, I got the sense that there were influential voices suggesting that conceivably this might be the beginning, at least the beginning of the end, based on the assumption, I suppose, of that domestic, local bad governance was one of the main root causes of this phenomenon, and democratization would fix this and thus pull the rug under jihadis. And as I mentioned, that was not to happen. At least hasn't materialized yet. So and this is, and here I've talked mainly about the times when things have gone worse than people predicted. I'm not going to say too much about the many times that things have gone better than people have predictions, because those times are so numerous that it's impossible to count. Because the number of times people have sort of said, the threat is going to increase, there's going to be a big attack, or something's bad is going to happen, or things are going to get worse, and then it hasn't, are the number of those instances are very large, is very large. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think you kind of know what I mean. So the point is, we have been wrong a lot of times, and why? So I think we may separate here, but distinguish here between things we should have known and things we have come to learn later. By things we should have known, I mean sort of general kind of methodological principles of scientific method, that sometimes they were not applied. And I'm thinking about, for example, that quite often, analyses around kind of the questions of, where the jihadi movement is going might be sort of relatively unstructured, rarely based on quantitative evidence, often based on qualitative and, if not, sort of anecdotal evidence. Often with quite a bit of fuzziness, like fuzziness around terminology, around what exactly are we, when we say what the future of jihadism, well, what exactly do we mean? Even when people are talking about the future of Al-Qaeda, that may sound much more specific, but for the longest time, we couldn't agree on what Al-Qaeda really was, and how kind of where it ends and something else begins. And so even that would be a bit fuzzy. And also, of course, this is weaved together with different with other forms of violent Islamist, phenomena. Because for some people, jihadism means only transnational violent jihadis of the Al-Qaeda or ISIS types. For another group of people, it means the transnational dimension is not that important. They talk about Salafi jihadism, and includes groups that operate primarily, perhaps it can include groups that operate mainly locally, but as long as they're in the same sort of epistemic community as Al-Qaeda and the rest, they're part of the same group. And there are yet others who think, well, we should include all, also other violent Islamist groups like Hamas and so on, the Taliban. So people have used these terms somewhat differently in different kind of analytical settings. Also, some fuzziness around measurement. It's not always clear whether so when you talk about the future, what aspects of the future are we talking about? Are we talking about the the activity level, or sort of the strength of the group? Are we talking about strategic direction or tactical choices? So the dependent variable hasn't always been explicit. And also on sometimes looseness around the scope or time horizon. Is this prediction for next week or next month or the next 5 years? Not always clear. Then we have things that we have learned later, and this is perhaps the core of my intervention here. Things that I think, things that I have learned, or I think I've learned about the phenomenon, and that we arguably couldn't really have known earlier, or at least with more difficulty, because it's sort of with later experiences and data that it becomes clear. So I have 5 main points here, 5 reasons why we have tended to get predictions wrong. The first is that this phenomenon is partly about ideas. And so we're talking about a highly ideological phenomenon, not exclusively, but there's a significant element of ideology here. And with that comes room for creativity. With it comes a room for disregarding kind of objective indicators. And for example, you can have, as you had in the late 90s, a group of several hundred people, perhaps a few thousand if you include sympathizers. I'm talking about early Al-Qaeda, that develops a kind of a worldview, an extremely anti-American worldview, to the point of deciding to wage a strategic military campaign against the United States during a period where you might argue, objectively speaking, America had not caused that many grievances on the ground in the Middle East. Certainly not compared to later eras, but even at that time, bear in mind that the United States supported the Afghan Mujahideen throughout the 1990s, more than they had perhaps supported almost any other sort of local resistance movement since the Second World War, and since the Vietnam War, and you have things like the intervention in Bosnia, etc. Now, of course, I'm familiar with all the arguments for bad things that the US did in the 80s and 90s, but the point is that arguably there's this larger distance between the kind of the more or less kind of objective, measurable grievances in this period and the worldview of Al-Qaeda than in a number of other kind of situations where you have a group that's angry about something. And I think this had largely to do with, an information problem inside the community. And this is a well-known from study of all kinds of terrorist groups, that you get peculiar worldviews because they close themselves off partially to the world and are selective in their information intake. And you have all kinds of social dynamics, internal outbidding, etc., that can lead to sort of particular ideas. And these ideological changes are difficult to predict from the outside. And this, I think, is an important reason for why we sometimes get this wrong. And this is particularly relevant to when we talk about the direction, the strategic direction that the movement takes. The second reason is that, broadly speaking, when we're talking about transnational militant Islamists like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, the foreign fighters, etc., it's really it's partly a corollary of conflict. So these groups thrive in and around conflicts, and conflicts are hard to predict. The Syria war being a case in point, and so there's a lot of kind of so all the things that make conflict difficult to predict, and this is an even bigger field, and with very serious, very serious work that's been on for a very long time on civil war, and there are limitations to what we can predict there on outbreak, and so those same problems apply to jihadism insofar as jihadi groups usually only thrive and grow in and around conflict zones. So that's another reason. The third reason is that it's a small-scale phenomenon. So for all, I mean, there are exceptions. I mean, there are contexts in which jihadi groups can have become very large, but by and large, they're smaller, much smaller than sort of the larger kind of militias or rebel groups that make up the main actors in civil war settings, for example. They're usually clandestine groups. They usually count in small numbers, and especially when you're talking about sort of the kind of the tone-setting groups, like a group like Al-Qaeda Core, a group of, a community of a few hundred people. And so in this small-scale phenomenon groups, there's a lot more. There's more contingency. There's more room for individuals with all their kind of kind of more proximate factors to play a role than if you have a larger organization. A fourth factor reason I think why we've had trouble predicting things is technology. That this movement, perhaps because it's clandestine, small, is sensitive to technological innovation. So its fate or its stock is high when it has access to technology that provide kind of easy dissemination of propaganda, for example, or that provide secret communication, all kinds of sort of protections from authorities who are after them. And I think we can say that the internet and its various and the various sort of digital technologies have we can link this to some extent the ebbs and flows of this movement to particular technologies. For example, in the early 2000s, a set of developments online, like increased bandwidth, cheaper digital cameras, etc., and new sort of platforms to share propaganda, an important boost for jihadi groups in the mid-2000s. Iraq war is by far about the most important factor in that story, but I think technology mattered too. But it's even more clear in the early 2010s with the rise of social media, and how the introduction of new platforms provided stealth and distribution capabilities to groups like Islamic State that no jihadi group had ever possessed in the past. And I'm quite convinced that this was a major driver behind that wave we had in the early to mid 2010s. Last, fifth and most important reason why we get things wrong is it's a game. Too often we analyze these groups as sort of as if they're alone in the field, free to decide their own way ahead. So if the group has, things that, oh, I'm going to go in this direction, I'm going to follow this new genius sort of strategy of this latest super smart ideologue, they're going to go there. We forget that they're in a strategic game with governments, and that what they do depends on what we do. There's too many social scientists for me to need to elaborate on this, but it's surprisingly kind of rarely taken into account, I would argue. I personally have been kind of guilty of this. I think I made that mistake. So the reason my 2016 paper about the future of jihadism in Europe was wrong is that I underestimated the length to which European governments would go to defeat Islamic State. I had underestimated the degree to which they would break norms and rules and previously declared ethical principles to defeat this enemy. And it's because they just took the gloves off and started doing things that I think would have made George W. Bush blush, that they pushed this phenomenon back. And I didn't see that coming because I didn't understand that game well enough. Moving forward, I think I'm probably soon out of time. Just going to say quickly that I can go into more detail about this in the Q&A perhaps, but bottom line is that we can, I think we can learn from some of these this prediction history to try and make better ones, notably on just on rigor, on being specific, on using good data, and on being systematic, and not last not least by making our underlying models explicit, our underlying assumptions clear, and so that we know that when we get things wrong, we have a sense of why they went wrong, and so we can reverse engineer our analysis more easily. I have thoughts about the future too, but I'll just stop there, just in the interest of time, so we can have a discussion.
Great, that's great. Thank you, Thomas, for those really very thought-provoking reflections. I definitely do want to get your sense of you having told us all of the perils of prediction, I'd love to get some predictions from you. But, I think you're making a really sophisticated set of points about how to do social science. But I guess the first question I want to ask you is, you are, one could be forgiven for hearing these comments and thinking that, Thomas Hegghammer is really telling us that we certainly need to be more rigorous, et cetera, et cetera. He's not telling us we shouldn't engage in the business of prediction, but he kind of is, right? You're kind of saying, look, let's just be very serious social scientists. We can study the past and, try to do really rigorous studies of political phenomena, but maybe we shouldn't really, quote unquote, try to market ourselves as oracles or try to really engage in the dirty river of forecasting. But I want to push back a little bit on that because, one of the things I've noticed about the work of political scientists who I admire most and from whom I learn the most is that they are deeply motivated. There's a sense of urgency in what they write. So, for example, the scholars who study democratization in the Arab world, which is the thing that I spend a lot of time obsessing about, regardless of where they're from, you can find in their biography some deep need to understand this issue and to contribute to the political emancipation of Arabs. And that's why their work is so good, right? And when I read work on jihadism, similarly, if you had asked me, and I don't know enough about your biography, I would say, this is a guy who's deeply motivated to understand this phenomenon because he wants us to be able to avoid it, to beat it back. He's not studying it because it's beautiful. He's not studying it because, for the same reason that some people study mathematical equations, right? He actually wants to solve a problem in the world. He wants to be able to predict when this is going to happen so we can avoid it. And that's what makes the work so good. And I worry that if we instead are, trying to get into the business of studying jihadism, a bunch of people who we're telling them, don't even be concerned about predicting this or helping us avoid it, then we're going to get some really bloodless studies that actually aren't going to be as good and aren't going to be as useful. How would you react to that?
That's a good question. I think generally speaking, I mean, I don't have a counterintuitive answer really. I'm going to say what you expect me to say, that enthusiasm is good, but it can go too far. But I guess a case can be made for being open about it. I think there's again, somewhat, in parallel to, making prediction, make them explicit. Don't pretend that you're not making them and then making them. If you feel strongly about an issue and you are an academic, there's no harm, I think, in being open about it. But and perhaps the illusion of complete objectivity is can be detrimental. But at the same time, of course, I mean, I think we all, all agree that, excessive enthusiasm can become bias, and that's where the problems start.
Right. What would you say to somebody who would look at the record of failed predictions, particularly really bad predictions that didn't come to pass, and would say, look, Professor Hegghammer, that's not an example of us getting things wrong. That's really an example of us getting things right. And because, as you say, this is a strategic interaction between a terrorist group and a government, the government saw Thomas Hegghammer's nightmare scenario, and they actually acted to avoid it. There's this great article from 1936 by Robert Merton And as you were talking, it was making me think of this. It's called Unintended Consequences of Purposive Social Action, 1936. And he talks about why our interventions in the world so often do not produce the consequences that we intended them to. And one of the mechanisms he describes is what he calls self-defeating prediction. Right, so you are predicting that these terrorists are going to emerge and threaten the heart of Europe, et cetera. And that was all correct until, of course, your prediction entered the world and people in the chancelleries of power said, oh, we're going to act on this to make sure it doesn't happen. So how would you know that you got it wrong as opposed to you got it so right that the world decided to make it wrong? If that makes any sense.
And that's an excellent point, and something that I've actually thought a lot about. And I always stress this point, in more specific context when I talk about when I do indulge in prediction, to distinguish between prediction absent competition and prediction with competition. So let's take the example of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan now. So in some sense, so the first scenario is, what will Al Qaeda do if it's completely free to do whatever he wants? If the United States and other powers have no say in the matter and will not act on it, what will they do? Well, it's quite likely they will try and go back to Afghanistan, set up new camps, etc., to reinvigorate their campaign. Is it likely? Hardly, because the international community has learned what such a buildup can lead to and will very likely intervene to stop it. So, the prediction, including competition, suggests a different outcome, and and sort of the net assessment. And and so that has direct implications for academic work, because you can end up in a situation like you described, that where a prominent academic, and I don't include myself in that category. I honestly don't think my study from 2016 is the reason why governments acted the way they did. But there may be other better cases of people who, really impactful academics who made some kind of, who saw something coming, warned of it, governments acted, and it didn't materialize. That is a thing. And I think perhaps a more sophisticated understanding of prediction will help us, make sense of that. And I think it's only if you don't understand those dynamics that you will kind of judge that early predictor harshly, or very, unnecessarily harshly. So, but like the takeaway here is I think I suppose is this interaction, also not interaction, but this sort of strategic interaction dynamic between governments and non-government actors.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I want to open it up for questions, so I'm going to encourage people to put up their hands using the raise hand function in Zoom. And while folks are finding that button, I'll ask one more question, because this is a really important set of pieces of advice to younger scholars, to people just starting out. Sort of you're kind of offering some commandments for good social science, leaving aside the goal of prediction. And what I found really interesting and a little bit surprising in your comments was you seemed to elevate quantitative evidence above qualitative evidence. Now, I could have been, I'm looking at your face to see if that's a misreading of what you said. And the reason I'm a little bit surprised by it is, you are, of course, one of the few people in our field who produces cutting edge work in both genres, quantitative and qualitative work. But your most recent book, this is a great work of what has to be called qualitative scholarship. And it's just a tour de force. I think it will be something that will be read, 100 years from now, or at least for as long as jihadism exists. And it will be deeply informative. And I think deeply informative for our ability to make predictions, in part because, as you just described, we are dealing with a phenomenon that is about ideas, that's ideological. So I don't know how you study ideology quantitatively. I mean, I can think of some examples. I'm seeing my good friend Rich Nielsen. If anybody can figure out how to do it, he can. But I mean, you also have to read the books and the pamphlets and the fatwas. And so if I asked you a really unfair question, it's actually, I'm going to ask you unfair and stupid question, but maybe it will give you something to riff off of. Do you really, am I correct in thinking that you said, look, we got to be rigorous and we got to collect quantitative evidence, and enough with the anecdote and the, do you really think that?
Yeah, I mean, because we're coming from a very qualitative base. That's why. So at least in the community of kind of specialists on militant or transnational militant Islamists, the overwhelmingly dominant approach is qualitative, and I happen to be primarily a qualitative person, but I'm above all of an empiricist, and I definitely see the value of more systematic, countable data, and I absolutely think that there's room for a lot more computational social science on ideology, for example, to study ideological text, to study ideological shifts in jihadi thinking computationally. I think it's absolutely possible. I mean, Rich has already done it, and there's room for even more. Now, for example, things are happening in the OCR field, which will allow us to study older jihadi texts, so we can study these developments over longer periods. So yeah, I mean, I'm not kind of a and I don't think anyone really is sort of a believer into that, that quantitative and measurable is always better, but we do, my point is, we do so little of it already in this particular domain that a little bit more will do good.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very helpful point. And I think if I might, I mean, because you're saying there is already such a strong qualitative base, you're not arguing for, folks who don't have the background in this area to just fire up R and start running, bag of words analyses on jihadi texts. You're arguing for the kind of scholar who spent the years that you have studying this, embedding yourself at least mentally in their kind of these worlds, also using these tools. I invoked Rich's name in vain, but I think one of the great things about his book, Deadly Clerics, is that you definitely see a scholar who's doing both of those things. They went to Egypt and engaged with Islamic scholars, got a sense of this world that they inhabit, and then that makes the quantitative analyses all that much more powerful and true. Okay, Thomas, I'm going to now open it up to the audience for questions. We already have a couple of hands up. Please raise your hand or message me in the chat if you would like to ask a question, and I will call on Professor Rich Nielsen first. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, thanks for embarrassing me, Tarek and Thomas. I'll say that there's a lot better work to be done and to follow in the quantitative analysis of texts. And I can weigh in more on this qual thing just a little bit to say that I think, so the comment first Thomas, and then a question following up on what Tarek said. The comment is that you might think about some of the Bayesian elicitation literature for saying, look, the goal is not necessarily to get quantitative predictions out of a statistical model, is perhaps to get quantitative measurements of uncertainty out of someone's brain that is based on deep qualitative knowledge. And so conceivably, you could have scholars working in whatever tradition they want, but if they could present their predictions in a more precise way, that would make them even evaluable, that we could even know whether they were right or wrong, because it would force them to be precise. And it would also give us, bands on, what sort of range of events would have been within a tolerance of what they were predicting, and who was really off. My question was about this issue of scholars influencing governments, which I've talked to a few government officials. I'm always skeptical of any influence I might have there. I wondered what your sense was, though, of your ability to capture the predictions that might even be influencing policymakers, because my impression is that they don't generally read through a paper or a book for the predictions. They invite the person to come to the room and then make for them a very specific prediction on a question that may never be made public. And I'm just not sure how we would evaluate whether, like with open source data, whether those predictions were accurate. I also wondered whether you'd have a sense of how the quality of those predictions might vary by the setting they're made in. So general predictions to satisfy the checkbox of being policy relevant in a book might not be as thought through as they ought to be. Maybe that's an autobiographical statement, I don't know. But certainly when a US general of rank sets you in a room and says, okay, is this going to happen or that going to happen? It sharpens the mind a little bit, and forces one to make a more precise prediction that might or might not be of higher quality, but certainly is not on the record in any data set that I think you'd collect. I'm just curious how you'd think about that type of prediction for the data collection exercise. You mentioned it got difficult, so maybe this is part of why.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think generally we don't matter very much, with an exception. And my sense is this is from it's both from my kind of work as an academic, but also from just like interactions. I've had the occasional interaction with very high level officials. So, for example, during the Islamic State crisis in Europe, I was invited to present before the Prime Minister of Norway, and I've had a few other sort of run-ins like that with very influential individuals. My sense is that what really has influence are these sort of big idea trade books. Not because they necessarily read them, because they have very powerful, often have very sort of compelling elevator pitches, which is sort of what sticks. And so the finer points of like the causal mechanism of radicalization in this, I mean, all this that sort of stuff doesn't really sticks. And I think I always think back, I mean, the older I get and the more I kind of work in this field, the more I realize that he was right. And the person who said, I think it was James Fear on it when I was at Stanford, that most of the time what we say is just ammunition for policy choices that someone wants to do anyway. So when you speak on some policy relevant issue, you are just contributing to a menu. You're helping populate a menu, and you're never the main dish. You're just one of several options, and in the end, the powerful people will make some decision, and based on this many, and if whatever option they go for, they will use the arguments, perhaps the arguments that you invoked, or cite your paper to back it up. I mean, I'm simplifying here, but I think broadly speaking, I think that's how it works. But I think what in terms of what can sway people quickly, I think it's these big idea trade books, and fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. I mean, but there's yeah. So that's just a phenomenon I've noticed.
It's fascinating. So, okay, we have Jed. I have a thought on this, but I want to get some other voices in. Jed Schwartz, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. I very sympathetic to your presentation, but the tension between, I mean, everything in mass society is sort of set up to try and make people think that what they say and do is not so important, and that other social forces will determine what is going to happen, and that individual thinking or speaking is of minimal importance. I personally disagree with that for myself, and that's maybe because I'm a little bit messed up. But I suspect that, and as far as what you're talking about, I'm a little disappointed that you didn't talk about your work itself, which I took the liberty of going to Amazon and looking your name up. And there's this book called The Caravan about somebody named, I'm forgetting his first name, Azam. And then you wrote a book about, I think, global jihadi culture.
Yep. Jed, what's the question? Just
the question. I mean, it's a request for some discussion of Dr. Hegghammer's actual work, the kinds of descriptions of the problem that he came up with, because descriptions are something entirely different from predictions.
Yep. Thank you, Jed.
To make a good prediction, which you probably may hope will not come true, you have to have an adequate description of what's actually happening. And I suspect that in your work, that's what is in your work. And I'm a little sad that you didn't talk about it more, and maybe hopeful that you will talk about it a bit in the next few minutes.
Okay, thanks, Jed. So if an interesting point about description versus prediction, and description being a very important and valid enterprise. And even though the questioner admits not having read your work, they correctly intuit that your descriptive work is of extraordinary quality. You had mentioned, you had tempted us at the outset, and maybe this will also satisfy the questioner, with that you were going to throw caution to the wind at some point and offer some predictions. And so let me just tee that up if I could. I mean, Afghanistan, as you point out, is now back to the Taliban. I don't know if you'd agree with the grim statement that I've often made, which is, 20 years after 9/11, Afghanistan is basically exactly where it was on the eve of 9/11. Maybe that's wrong, but what do you see happening? Do you see a resurgent a jihadi movement, transnational violent jihadi movement, operating now out of an ungovernable Afghanistan? What are some other trends that at least we should be looking out for?
Yeah, and I want to thank Judge Schwartz also for his comment, and I appreciate the interest in the work. And if I didn't go more into my previous research, it was, I guess, partly because it's I was afraid of going into too much detail and speaking for too long, and the Caravan is 800 pages long. So
and I'm just going to interrupt you, Thomas, and say, when COVID is over, we're going to have you back here in person, and then we're going to, you can give multiple talks as far as I'm concerned, because I'd really, there's an endless appetite for your work. Sorry, go on.
That's very kind. I can make a connection, though, between the story of the Afghan jihad in the 1980s and prediction. So, for example, as we all know, the US and other Western countries supported the Afghan struggle against the Soviets. And later on, some of the people who were fighting, also fighting alongside the Afghans, some of these Arab Afghans became Al Qaeda. They turned against the US, and they became kind of the the seed of this sort of jihadi movement. Should the US have seen this coming? So in my book, I show that, for example, that there were a lot of signs that the Afghan Arabs were anti-Western, that they were anti-Western earlier than we have tended to think. So I think I'm simplifying it. The standard narrative of Al Qaeda is that they were kind of working with the US until the Gulf War, in which they became angry because of troops in Saudi, etc. I show that they were extremely anti-American throughout the 1980s, and in fact, they became more anti-American as the US ramped up its support for their cause. And this could have been picked up by Western analysts if they had paid closer attention and had better data on their writing, on the Afghan Arab writings. At the same time, you can understand why they didn't think in those terms, because there had not yet at that point ever been an attack in the West by a Sunni Islamist group. So it was unprecedented. And so, that likely shaped, analyses. So, there are numerous kind of episodes like that in jihadi history. I think, we could, where there's where we could discuss, the predictions that were made at the time and how and why they were wrong. So about the present, Afghanistan, I don't see a return to sort of pre-9/11, the pre-9/11 situation as far as Al Qaeda is concerned, because history is Bayesian. We learn from the past and update information and adjust our behavior accordingly. So we know that a build-up, I mentioned this before, we know that an Al Qaeda build-up in Afghanistan can lead to trouble. So we can be fairly certain that states like the US will intervene to prevent it from happening. Also, and that the threat of that happening is perhaps also a deterrent for Taliban, incentivizing the Taliban to take early action to make such a kind of at least a major build-up implausible. As far as jihadism outside of kind of more widely it's concerned, let's think about the West, for example. Jihadism in North America and Europe. We're going to get a new sort of, if there's a new conflict like Syria in a different place, we'll get new foreign fighters, we'll get kind of a new type of Islamic State. I think that's highly unlikely, partly because of the same phenomenon, this experience factor, that governments will act earlier and more resolutely because they know what it can lead to. But there's another factor, and I write about this in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, in a piece called "Resistance is Futile," which is about the role of technology in shifting power in favor of states in their relationship with non-state actors in a Western context. I'm arguing that the technology have made Western states extremely powerful political repressors, or another term, or an extremely powerful counter terrorists. Just with all the sensors in our societies, the size of the systems in place to exploit those sensors for intelligence analysis, etc., etc., the rise of machine learning. I mean, it's just so. I mean, rich, well-resourced governments can just nip early mobilization attempts in the bud so much earlier and so much more efficiently than they could just 15 or 20 years ago, that I think is just extremely difficult for sort of any type of organized violent campaign to happen. So I mean, something individual instances will very well happen. There may be an attack here and there, but a kind of a more systemic, sustained wave is I think is very unlikely in the next few years, I think. But again, I mean, I've been wrong so many times that I don't listen to me. Don't listen to me.
Well, I think we should not listen to the last sentence you offered, but we should listen to everything else. I mean, we should listen to you. The one thing I will say, and we're coming to the end of our time, is just, as you pointed out, this is a kind of game, and we spend a lot of time analyzing the jihadists, but not enough time analyzing the governments that are going to interact with the jihadists. And, so when I asked you to make the prediction about Afghanistan, your analysis of the US or the European governments is they're not going to let it happen. But of course, the technological tools that you're talking about that allow them to monitor their own citizens to see which ones of them might be leaning jihadists, the increased scrutiny that people get at the border, the increased security measures that we have at airports and other kind of soft targets. You could imagine an American administration that's weary of engagement in the world saying, you know what, we don't really care if Al-Qaeda establishes another beachhead in Afghanistan because they're never going to be able to do anything here. And maybe they can do damage in the Middle East. Maybe Afghanistan can be a staging ground for Al-Qaeda to operate in other weak areas. But it's, we have so much faith, well-placed faith in our own hardened defenses that we don't need to actually send people back into the mountains of Afghanistan to root out every little terrorist. Is that a completely implausible read that I just offered?
No, I think there are multiple scenarios in which the kind of the that repressive sort of posture is lifted or pressure is lifted. So what you're describing is kind of an overconfidence in protection or technological defenses,
coupled with just deep weariness, particularly by the currently ascendant, political party, at least in the U.S.
And you can think about others like just resource shortage that it's just becomes very expensive to maintain these systems to track terrorists, and that we decide to spend money on other things, and or complacency, that years pass by with very little happening, and we decide to move on to other things. There are tons of other issues that might arguably should also take up more attention. But I mean, I can see a number of scenarios in which this becomes a space opens up for a certain sort of rebounds. But I still think that we're generally talking about systems, and often we're talking about kind of legal precedents too, that like there's certain sort of basically restraints on government powers that were there in the past. They've been broken, and it's just, at least my knowledge of history suggests that they rarely put back in place. I mean, they're rarely. I mean, just the incentives are stacked such, for politicians that it takes a lot to really kind of rewind some of these kind of emergency measures or sort of special powers that have been afforded. So even the resources might decline, but the kind of the qualitative content of the systems, like the legal abilities and sort of some of these practices, they will not, they can exist even in a low resource situation. Yeah. And so what you then just have to do is just pump resources back in again, and you're up and running. So overall, I'm I don't know if optimistic or pessimistic is the word, but I think it's not a good time to be a jihadi, a transnational jihadi.
That's great. That's a wonderful note on which to end. I want to thank Professor Thomas Hegghammer for this really thought-provoking discussion. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and to remind everybody that our next Middle East Initiative event will happen on Thursday, October 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be a conversation with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi on the future of Palestine. I hope you'll join us for that. You can find out more about that event and about all of our other events at our website, hks.harvard.edu/Middle East. But for now, once again, I want to offer from the bottom of my heart a deep thanks to Professor Hegghammer. And I very much intend that we will be able to host you in person to continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Tarek. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.